Hey, this is Ocean K with an introduction to the concept of modular synthesis. This video is for people who are completely new to the idea of modular synthesis. I'll use the A-Series set of rack extensions as our example, but we'll also look at other devices in Reason just to see what semi-modular synthesis looks like as well. So, to start, we need to understand how sounds are made in a synthesizer. And I tend to think that it's easiest to understand by thinking about how synths were originally constructed. So, of course, we're using software synths in Reason, but originally synths were physical machines with electronics inside. There was no computer, no microprocessor. They were just transistors and resistors and capacitors and things like that. And what you'd do to start with is you'd solder up some electronics and you'd have something that would make it just a sound, a simple sound. It would be called an oscillator because a basic sound is just a waveform that oscillates back and forth. So a thing that oscillates fast enough to be audible would be called our oscillator. Now, if we hook up an A-series, and we've got our oscillator here, if we just hook up this audio out of the oscillator into our mix channel, we hear a sound. Now, if we bring up our MIDI channel, we can't change the pitch of the sound, and in fact, we can't even turn this sound off. It's just a single oscillation that's just oscillating at a single pitch. Well, if there was a way that we can control the speed at which it oscillates, we could start to produce different pitches. So one way to do that is instead of hardwiring the oscillation speed into the oscillator circuit, we would solder up some knobs to affect the speed of the oscillation. So we could turn the knob and slow the oscillation and turn the knob up and speed up the oscillation. Now, on the A-Series VCO, if we hook up our oscillator and we look at the front, we do have some knobs that can change the pitch. In this case, we can change the octave and the tune and the fine tune. And so now we're able to change the pitch of the oscillator. But our MIDI keyboard still doesn't work. So imagine how laborious it would be that every time you wanted a different note, you had to automate these knobs. So let's turn this back off. If there was a way that we could sort of hook up our keyboard. So what would be great is if we could wire up our keyboard to send electrical signals to our oscillator and somehow tune the oscillator so that when I play a note on a keyboard, the speed of the oscillation matches the pitch of that keyboard note. Well, we can do that, and what we do is we have our keyboard output a voltage signal that's controlled by the keyboard. Now, we'll call this a control voltage signal, or a CV signal. And what we would do is we'd solder up our oscillator to accept CV signals. We would just wire in a jack that we could hook up our keyboard to. Now, let's do that. In the A-Series, our A19 SEQ is where our MIDI data is funneled through. So if we connect our CV data from our keyboard and hook it into our CV jack of the oscillator, we can hook up our audio back, and now when I play my keyboard, I can get different pitches. Now, of course, the CV signal changes the speed of the oscillation, the pitch, but we still can't change the volume of the note, and we can't even make it stop or start. To do that, we need a separate set of electronics. In this case, what we need is something sort of like a volume knob. Well, in Reason, we already have a volume knob with the mix channel. So if we look at our mix channel here, we can turn our note on and off. So if we wanted to play a little keyboard part, what we do is we would select the note, bring up our volume, select our second note, bring up the volume, our third note, and so on until we finished our song. Right? But you can imagine how automating the channel fader every time we wanted to play a note on or off would be just crazy. And so what would be cool is that if we could use our same keyboard signal and say that every time we press down on our key, we want the volume to go up, and then every time we release the key on the keyboard, we want the volume to go back down. Well, In the olden days, we would solder up a bunch of electronics to do just that. Now, we talked about how our keyboard can send out note data, pitch data for our oscillator for pitch, but our keyboard can also send out velocity data, data about how hard we press the key. When the velocity is anything above 0, that means we pressed a key, and how much the signal is above 0 is the velocity of our note, how loud it is. Then when the velocity goes back down to 0, that means that we released the note. So while we're sending out our note pitch data, it'd be cool if we could also send out gate and velocity data. And it turns out that we can. If we look at the back of any of the Reason synthesizer devices, we see that there are two CV for sequencer control. There's a CV and there's a gate. Now the CV we already talked about with our VCO. That's where our note data, our pitch data goes. But our gate, that's what sends out our velocity information and our key down and key up information. So with the A-Series, we can hook up our we can solder up some electronics that take in note on and note off data. And if we run our oscillator through that data, we should be able to control both the pitch of our sound and the volume of our sound, and when the sound is on and off. The set of electronics that controls the volume or the amplitude of our sound based on CV signals is called a voltage-controlled amplifier, or a VCA. And in the A-Series, here is our VCA, the A13 VCA. So let's run our keyboard gate signal to our VCA gain. So this is gain like amplification, right? Turning up the mix channel. And instead of our oscillator going directly to our mix channel, we'll have our oscillator go into the VCA, which is then going to control our volume up and down, and we'll have the out of our VCA go into our mix channel. Now we can bring our mix channel volume back up, and now when I play a note on the MIDI keyboard, we hear that we've got pitch data, and we also hear that we have volume data, which controls the note on and the note off. Now, at this point, we have a very first super basic synth. It's a single oscillator, basic synth. It's just a sine wave oscillator, and that goes into our VCA, which is controlling our note on and note off information. Now, this may not sound very exciting as a synth, but if you've just spent the previous 2 months or 2 years soldering and resoldering to get to this point, this is cause for major celebration. But for us, let's just think about what we can do next. What is the next component that we'd build? Well, it's probably something to deal with the fact that while you can now control the volume with your keyboard, it gets a little boring that your volume exactly follows the keyboard, meaning that you press a key and the sound immediately jumps at that full volume of your velocity and stays exactly there until you release the key, and then it goes to complete silence immediately. What if you wanted the sound to fade in when you press a key, or fade out after you release the key? Or maybe you don't want the note to sustain at the same level the whole time. Well, in that case, you want your VCA to be triggered by the keyboard gate, but you don't want the volume to follow the gate exactly. Now, in synthesizer terms, the fade in of a sound is called the attack. And the fade out time after you've released the key is called the release. The volume that you want the note to sit at after you've held the note for a while is called the sustain level. And the time that it takes the volume to go from full level when you press the key to the sustain level is called the decay. Now that graph of the attack fade in, the decay fade down to the sustain level, and then the release after the key off signal is called an envelope. So instead of our pressing a note on the keyboard directly controlling the volume of our sound, we want our key press to trigger the running of an envelope, and then have that envelope drive the volume of our sound. Well, the group of electronics that creates an envelope is called an envelope generator. The concept of attack, decay, sustain, and release is often shortened to ADSR. And so that's what we have, an ADSR envelope generator in the A-series. So let's hook this up and see how it sounds. If we have the keyboard gate go to the envelope generator, and then the envelope generator goes into the gain of our VCA, then when I set the attack time and the release time, we can hear that there's a fade in when I press the note, and when I release the note, there's a fade out. Now, if you wanted to make pads, right, you would have a very slow attack and a very slow release. Right? So, believe it or not, for many years, this was the extent of synthesis. You can add effects like filters or delays or reverbs or distortions, but in terms of pure synthesis, this was it. And one way to see this is, let's actually look at the Subtractor synthesizer in Reason. This was Reason's very first synthesizer. Now, if we look at the Subtractor, we see that we have two oscillators. We've got oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And that's just like the oscillator in the A-series. There are two of them, so they're just mixed together with a basic mixer. Now, we don't see a VCA. The VCA in the Subtractor is actually hard-coded in. It's just in the background. We don't get to tweak anything. It's just hard-coded. Now, we have an amplitude envelope, which is just like our ADSR, and this has attack, decay, sustain, and release. Right? Now we also have other things. We have like two filters here, right? And we can process, instead of the A-series going directly to our mix channel, we can certainly put it through filters or distortions or echoes or delays or something like that. In this case, there are two filters in the Subtractor that are just hard-coded in. Now you'll notice that the filter has its own envelope generator, and so this controls parameters around the filters. There's also a modulation envelope that controls certain modulators of the Subtractor. There are other things. There are two LFOs, which just add some variety. And an LFO would probably be the next module you will build after your oscillator and your VCA and your envelope generator. In the A-series, we have our LFO right there. But the LFO isn't always necessary. In fact, many Subtractor patches don't ever use the LFO. The bass guitar default patch, in fact, uses none of the LFOs. There's some extra stuff on the Subtractor around the mod wheels and the pitch wheels and some velocity stuff. But essentially, you can see how the components of the Subtractor are very similar to the components of our very basic A-series synth. Now, there are a few big differences between our synth and the Subtractor, and one of them is that all of the audio and CV connections between our A-series, VCO, and VCA and envelope generator, we see those, whereas in the Subtractor, we don't see any of those. In the Subtractor, they're all hard-coded. Now, when using the Subtractor, you're using all of the Subtractor's electronics, if you will, in a single arrangement that you can't change. Now, when looking at our synth, I can change how these are hooked up. I can change the order. I can decide whether we're going to use an envelope generator or not, how many oscillators we use, how they're hooked up, whether they all go into the VCA or a mixer or filter before the envelope generator or after the envelope generator, or anything like that. So a big difference between a Subtractor and the A-series is that the Subtractor is all hard-coded in how the components fit together. The A-Series is completely open to how all the components fit together. Now, there's a good side and a bad side to what the Subtractor does. Now, because everything is hard-coded in the Subtractor, you can't control how things are hooked up, and that's a limitation. But on the other hand, everything is hooked up in the Subtractor, so you don't have to know how oscillators hooked up to voltage control amplifiers and how envelope generators work and whether they're routed before or after the VCA. You don't have to worry about any of that with a Subtractor. So the learning curve for the Subtractor is very short, right? You just dump it in the rack and you can start playing. Whereas with the A-Series, you have to hook things up first. So the Subtractor is much easier, but the A-Series is much more flexible. Now, that's the Subtractor. Let's look at Thor. Thor is sort of a different beast here. Now, Thor is what's called a semi-modular synth. The A-Series is a fully modular synth because every component is a separate module that you hook up in any way that you want. The Subtractor is what's called a self-contained synth because all the modules are in a single box and they're all hardwired together, so there's no modularity. Thor is what's called a semi-modular synth because you can swap out, for instance, different oscillators, and different oscillators contain different sound generators like oscillators or wavetable synths or something like that. But when you're using sound generators, you have to use these predetermined ones. Now, you can also do the same thing with filters. You can change what sort of filter you want, but you're limited to this set of filters. If, for instance, you want a filter to go between the oscillators or your sound generators and your amplification or your envelopes, you can only use these filters. Now, Thor also allows you to route things in some different ways, but there are a predetermined number of ways of routing. You can choose between certain routings, but you're limited to the only types of routings that Thor gives you. Now, Thor addresses some of these limitations by using what's called a modulation matrix, which allows you to control certain parameters using other parameters, but it's still a limited set of parameters, and it still doesn't solve some of the routing limitations. A fully modular synth like the A-Series solves all of those problems. You don't need a modulation matrix because you can hook up any module to any other module in any order that you want that makes sense for the audio or the CV signals to make it through. Now, there's also a very big difference between modular synths and semi-modular synths and self-contained synths. Now, looking at Thor as an example, you have a handful of sound sources, but you can only use those sound sources. And like I said, same with the filters. With the A-Series, because all of these ins and outs are completely exposed, you can buy a VCO from some other developer, and it'll work with all of these components. Now, in the real world, in the sort of physical world of modular synths, there are dozens, hundreds of different makers of modular synth components. And, so you have a selection of, dozens at least, different VCOs out there, oscillators out there. And you can buy an oscillator from any maker, and assuming they're using compatible formats, it'll work with all of your other components. Now, same thing in Reason. If other developers develop any one of these components, maybe a much more complicated envelope generator, well, you can use you can use the A-Series VCA, but use a different developer's envelope generator to get a different sound. You can't do that with Thor, and you certainly can't do that with Subtractor or really any other synth in Reason. The A-Series is the first synth to allow you to pick and choose between synth components from multiple developers. Now, that's pretty much what modular synthesis is. We've looked at the three most fundamental components: the voltage control oscillator, the voltage control amplifier, and the envelope generator. We've seen how Reason uses these components in the Subtractor and in Thor, and we've talked a little bit about the difference between self-contained, semi-modular, and fully modular synths. Now, to learn more about the A-Series in general, check out the A-Series introduction video. And there are also videos for every single component in the A-Series 1 and in the A-Series 2 rack extensions. These are all linked in the descriptions. So to learn what each and every single one of these components does and how you can hook it up with other components, check out those detailed videos. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or post in the Reason user forum. I'm on there all the time. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.